I am Mariam, born March 14th, 1987, in Lagos, Nigeria, and I was initiated into the occult before I ever knew peace. I am not repeating rumors or teaching theory. I carried out real spiritual assignments as an ex-warlock, and our targets were believers who prayed and fasted. I speak now with regret and urgency because January 29 is not ordinary, and what was done in secret is being exposed. You will like this video, comment, and share it, because this warning is prophetic and time sensitive. You will watch until the very end, because stopping early leaves you vulnerable. Hidden truths are surfacing, danger is real, and a forbidden pattern is about to be uncovered. January 29 was never random. In the occult, nothing is accidental. Dates are doors. Some are sealed. Some are forced open with blood, vows, and repetition. When I was still inside the coven, January 29 was marked long before the calendar year began. It was circled. It was whispered. It was prepared for, because it sat at a dangerous intersection between intention and alignment. You were never told this. You were just living your life, praying, working, trusting God. And that is exactly why believers were the primary focus. January 29 was used as a reset trigger, not for unbelievers, for you. In spiritual operations, we watched believers closely in January. Fatigue was high. Hope was fragile. Expectations were stretched thin. Many were waiting for change that had not yet manifested. That emotional state mattered, because spiritual attacks are more effective when the soul is tired. January 29 was used to seal discouragement, not create it. The discouragement was already there. The date was used to lock it in. We called it a confirmation window, a moment when negative patterns could be spiritually reinforced if the believer stayed passive. I remember the first January 29 assignment I participated in. No screaming, no candles in public view, no obvious ritual. That is what most people misunderstand. Real. Spiritual warfare is quiet. The assignment was simple: to reinforce delay, to echo disappointment, to spiritually agree with the believer's private fear that nothing will change this year. That agreement mattered more than any spell. January 29 was chosen because it sits late enough in the month for hope to be tested, but early enough to redirect expectation. It was a pivot point. If a believer entered that day discouraged, unfocused, or spiritually asleep, goal was to anchor that emotional state and stretch it into the coming months. We targeted prayer lives not by stopping prayer, by making it feel empty. We targeted faith, not by destroying it, by making it feel delayed. We targeted vision, not by blinding it, by making it feel unrealistic. And we did it by agreement, not force. That is why January 29 matters, because heaven honors alignment. And so does darkness. What you do on a spiritually marked day speaks louder than what you say. Believers think danger looks dramatic. It does not. Danger looks like indifference, like distraction, like scrolling, like postponing prayer until tomorrow. January 29 was used to observe who would remain spiritually alert when nothing obvious was happening. Inside the occult, we believed that days like this revealed authority levels. Who knew who they were and who didn't. Those who stood firm, prayed intentionally, and declared truth were removed from targeting lists. Yes, removed. Those who drifted emotionally became long-term projects. I say this with regret because I helped mark those lists. January 29 was also tied to word agreements. What believers spoke over themselves mattered more on that day. Statements like, "I'm tired. This year feels the same. Maybe this is just my life." Those words were not ignored. We were taught that words spoken on January 29 carried extended influence because the day was used to set the tone of continuation, not beginnings. Continuation. That is key. January 1 sets intention. January 29 tests endurance. That is why many believers feel unexplained heaviness around that time. Not because God is absent, but because pressure is applied to see what remains. You were never weak for feeling it. You were targeted. I remember watching believers post scriptures publicly while privately doubting. That split mattered. The occult feeds on internal contradiction. January 29 exposed that fracture. This is why I am warning you now, not to scare you, to wake you. The danger of January 29 is not what happens to you. It is what you silently accept. Acceptance is agreement. Agreement is access. But here is what was never told to you. January 9 also terrified the occult because believers who recognized the pressure and responded with authority disrupted everything. A single prayer spoken with clarity broke weeks of preparation. A single declaration of trust dismantled layered assignments. We lost operations because one believer refused emotional agreement. That is why I am speaking now. Because once you understand the significance, the power shifts. January 29 does not belong to darkness. It never did. It was only used because believers were unaware. Awareness changes jurisdiction. If you are listening to this, you are no longer ignorant. You are no longer passive. You are no longer an easy target. What you do with this knowledge matters. And this is only the first layer. What I am about to tell you was never shared outside inner circles. Because it exposes patterns, not practices. And patterns are harder to defend. January 29 was never about one ritual. It was about timing reinforcement. Inside the occult, we were taught that power does not always come from action. It comes from repetition aligned with expectation. January 29 sat inside a cycle we called echo days. Days used to repeat spiritual conclusions already forming in a believer's mind. That matters. Because whatever conclusion you reach about your life becomes the lens through which everything else flows. On January 29, we didn't summon demons the way movies show. We observed, we listened, we synchronized. Believers assume witches always initiate. Often, we only respond. If a believer entered January 29 already thinking, "This year feels blocked," the assignment was not to create blockage. It was to agree with the thought and amplify it. Agreement creates permission. That is how access was gained. January 29 was used to lock narratives, not circumstances. Narratives. The story you told yourself about your marriage, your finances, your calling, your health. If the story leaned toward defeat, the day was used to cement it emotionally. That is why so many believers experience a strange sense of finality around that date, as if decisions were silently made without discussion. That feeling was not random. We were trained to work with emotional conclusion points, moments when a person internally says, "Enough, nothing is changing. This is my reality." January 29 was one of those moments. And here is the part that should make you alert. The strongest operations did not require the believer to sin, only to stop resisting internally. Silence can be louder than rebellion. I remember a January 29 operation involving intercessors, people who prayed daily, people who fasted. The assignment failed, not because they prayed longer, but because they refused emotional resignation. They acknowledged frustration but rejected conclusion. That broke alignment. Darkness cannot operate where conclusion is suspended. That is a law. January 29 was also used as a spiritual audit day. We assessed which believers were living from promise and which were living from observation. Those living from observation were easier to influence because observation is based on what is seen. Promise is based on what is spoken. The occult fears spoken authority. That is why distraction mattered so much on that day, keeping believers busy, emotionally overwhelmed, mentally scattered, not sinful, just unfocused, because focus determines flow. January 29 targeted believers who were waiting for confirmation before acting in faith. We exploited hesitation. If a believer delayed obedience because they were waiting for clarity, the day was used to stretch that delay. Delay feels reasonable, but spiritually, delay can become agreement. That is why many people look back at January 29 and say, that's when something shifted. Yes, something did, but not because darkness is stronger, because awareness was missing. Here is what breaks the pattern. January 29 loses power the moment a believer interrupts internal dialogue. The moment you say, I will not conclude negatively. I will not interpret delay as denial. I will not downgrade expectation. That single decision collapses weeks of preparation. We hated decisive believers because they could not be synchronized. January 29 was also feared because some believers unknowingly turned it into an altar day, not with objects, with declarations. They fasted, they prayed, they worshipped intentionally. That reversed flow. Instead of being an echo day for discouragement, it became an echo day for authority. When that happened, assignments rebounded. I saw fear inside the coven, real fear. Because when believers align consciously, darkness retreats fast. That is why this date was hidden from you. Not because it was powerful on its own, but because you are powerful when aware. January 29 only magnifies what is already present. Faith magnifies faith. Doubt magnifies doubt. The date does not choose the outcome. You do. But ignorance allowed others to choose for you. Not anymore. If you are hearing this, you are being repositioned. You are no longer reacting, you are responding. And there is still more you must understand. Because the greatest danger of January 29 was not the rituals. It was the aftermath. And that is what I will expose next. The most damaging part of January 29 never happened on the day itself. It happened after. That is what believers were never warned about. Inside the occult, January 29 was treated as a handover point, not an attack day, a transition day. Whatever emotional and spiritual posture a believer carried on that date was handed forward into the coming weeks. We called it the carryover effect. Because spirits do not need to keep attacking if the believer carries the weight for them. After January 29, assignments shifted from pressure to maintenance. Maintenance is harder to detect. No sudden crisis, no dramatic collapse, just slow dullness. Prayer becomes routine. Worship loses fire. Expectation weakens. Not because God withdrew, but because the believer unconsciously accepted a ceiling. I watch believers continue doing the right things while expecting less. That is a dangerous place because reduced expectation limits reception. January 29 was used to introduce settlement thinking. Thoughts like, at least it's not worse. Maybe this is just my season. I should be grateful and stop asking for more. Gratitude is powerful. But false contentment is a trap. Darkness fears hunger. It exploits resignation. The aftermath period targeted believers who stopped contending internally. They still believed God could. They just stopped believing God would. That shift mattered. Because faith that does not expect movement becomes passive. And passive faith does not threaten darkness. I remember monitoring believers weeks after January 29. No visible sin, no rebellion, just emotional settling. They stopped praying with urgency, stopped declaring boldly, stopped imagining change. The assignment succeeded when hope became theoretical instead of active. January 29 created an emotional conclusion that quietly governed behavior. That is why many believers look back and say, I don't know when I stopped believing for that. Now you know. The aftermath also affected decisions. Believers delayed starting businesses, delayed ministry steps, delayed conversation, delayed obedience. They called it wisdom, but often it was fear disguised as patience. Darkness loves delay that sounds spiritual. January 29 planted hesitation that grew into long-term postponement. And here is the hardest truth. Many believers blamed themselves. They thought they lacked faith. They thought they missed God. They thought they were unworthy. That self-blame strengthened the effect. Because condemnation silences authority, I regret participating in that. But I am exposing it now so it breaks. Because awareness disrupts maintenance cycles. The moment you recognize the pattern, the aftermath loses grip. January 29 did not determine your year. It tested your awareness. And tests can be retaken. You are not late. You are not behind. You are not disqualified. You are being recalibrated. The moment you reject settlement thinking, the carryover breaks. The moment you reintroduce expectation, momentum returns. I saw it happen. Believers who woke up months later and re-engaged spiritually dismantled everything that was set. Darkness cannot enforce agreements you no longer honor. That is the law. January 29 only had power where silence remained. But silence ends now. Because there is one final layer you must understand. The part that restores authority completely. The part the occult feared most. And that is what I will reveal next. This is the final layer. The part the occult feared the most. Because it is irreversible once applied. January 29 only had power because believers were unaware of their authority. Not ignorance of God, not weakness, but ignorance of timing, agreement, and expectation. Once you understand the mechanics, you can reclaim control. First, you must declare awareness. Say it aloud. I know what was done. I see the pattern. I will not agree with delay or discouragement. This simple declaration interrupts the spiritual flow that darkness relied on. Second, you must act with intentional faith. Do not wait for perfect timing. Do not wait for confirmation. January 29 no longer dictates the rhythm of your life. You do. Third, you must replace agreement with action. Where January 29 reinforced delay, you will reinforce progress. Where it whispered resignation, you will speak expectancy. Where it demanded silence, you will worship and declare. I remember the first time I personally attempted this reversal. After years inside the coven, I tested the very mechanisms I once deployed. I watched months of spiritual pressure dissolve in a single act of faith, nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just authority reclaimed. Fourth, teach others the awareness, share knowledge, expose patterns. Do not let believers remain passive targets. January 29 becomes a day of empowerment instead of a day of subtle oppression. It can no longer hold dominion over those who know. It cannot reinforce discouragement where expectation is active. It cannot prolong delay where decisive obedience occurs. You must do this with persistence. Repetition matters. You cannot reclaim authority once and forget. You must solidify it. Finally, remember this: spiritual power is relational, not ritualistic. Your faith, your declarations, your obedience, these are the mechanisms that overpower darkness. Dates cannot dictate outcomes. Assignments fail where believers refuse agreement. Authority is yours. This is the truth I risked revealing, the truth that exposes hidden danger and restores divine advantage. January 29 is no longer a day of stealth attack. It is a day of prophetic breakthrough for those who rise. You are no longer a passive target. You are a believer awake, aware, and acting. And the spiritual shift begins now. You have seen what was hidden. You have heard what was forbidden. The patterns, the pressure, the aftermath, all are now exposed. You are no longer unaware. You are no longer passive. You are no longer under silent agreement. Comment below. Share this revelation. Confirm that you watched until the very end. From this moment, your authority is restored. Your faith is active. Your expectation is unshakable. January 29 no longer holds power over you. Rise boldly. Declare triumph. Walk in unstoppable victory.